And now we dive into Photoshop's little used and less understood third dimension, where we'll create and assemble the next element of our design. And while Photoshop is not a full-featured 3D environment like my 3D Studio Max or my personal favorite 3D program, Cinema 4D, it can still do some pretty cool and amazing things, especially integrated in the Photoshop environment with access to the other tools you know and love. As long as you stay within the confines of Photoshop's strengths, you can do some really cool stuff. I'll point out that this chapter will tax the limits of the capabilities of my last generation Mac Pro. If you're using a really hot graphics card, especially on Windows, you'll likely see much better performance. But I felt that by presenting on this machine, we represent a more real-world compromise in performance, and it's probably more representative of at least half the machines out there. At any rate, I'll try not to go too fast, and if I do, you can always hit the pause button. Oh, also, there are things that appear on screen in Photoshop's 3D world that are handled by OpenGL. So if your machine doesn't have a minimum level card supported by Photoshop, you may not see everything that I'm showing you. I'll try to point these things out when we come across them, and hopefully you can still follow along as best you can. Anyway, here we go. Into the third dimension. The next element in our design is a golden chalice. And if we look in Bridge, you'll see a couple of photographs here of the same chalice that I used for inspiration. And this really amazing artifact is from the crown jewels of Denmark. This is from a museum in Copenhagen that's in the basement of the Rosenborg Castle. Well, the entire castle is a museum, but the crown jewels are in the basement. And this particular chalice dates back to 1625. Now think about that for just a second. We've got a chalice here made of gold. It's got a nice little pattern on the top, this very, very interesting jeweled work at the bottom, and this delicate ivory skull in the center with these bones sticking out of it. This thing is 150 years older than our country, and nobody's broken off these bones over all the years. That's just amazing to me. I can't keep wine glasses around the house for more than a week or two without breaking them. So it's just extraordinary to me that this thing has survived all those many years. It also looks a little bit diabolical, but it's worth pointing out that this symbol in the center, the skull and crossbones, which we know as a pirate symbol or maybe a label on a bottle of poison, actually started out years ago as a symbol for Christianity. This represented the crucifixion, with the skull representing death and the crossed bones representing the cross. So this was used actually throughout Scandinavia, in particular, during the early days of the Christian church, and that's why it ended up in this chalice. Today, of course, we don't have that association, and I loved the look of this. It kind of fits with the vaguely diabolical design that we're trying to create, so I thought this would be a great element to include in our design. Now, we could, of course, just use one of these photographs, but let's assume that we don't have the rights to them or they're not high enough resolution to actually incorporate. So let's take this as an opportunity to build this object inside Photoshop. And we're going to use the 3D tools that have recently been added to Photoshop in order to accomplish this. We're going to do this in 3 key stages. The top stage, this cup with the little finial down below it, is fairly straightforward once you learn the trick. The bottom of it, the base here, is quite complex. We're going to do it rather quickly, but it actually takes advantage of some old 3D modeling tricks that you're probably not familiar with, and it's kind of a fun thing to do. And the center element is probably beyond the scope of a lesson in Photoshop's 3D tools, so we're actually going to import the skull as a 3D object and include it in our scene. So let's switch over to Photoshop and take a quick look at how 3D Space works. The first thing that I want to do is adjust our workspace, and I'm going to choose Advanced 3D. That's going to bring up a new panel that you may not have seen, the 3D panel, and I'm going to pull that out, open up our layers, and I'm going to butt our 3D panel up against our Layers panel. It's going to allow us to view both of them because we're going to be using both of them throughout this chapter. And let's make ourselves a new document. And bear with me here. We're going to make this document at a kind of an odd size, and there's method to my madness here. I'm actually going to ask you to create a document. We'll call it Chalice. And we're going to pick this size, 550 pixels by 550 pixels. The reason for this will become clear a little bit later when I'm showing you how to troubleshoot a few things. And ultimately, when you're doing your designs in Photoshop, you'll probably want to work at a higher resolution. But a good thing about Photoshop 3D is it's kind of resolution independent. You're free to change the resolution down the road, and the objects should scale pretty nicely with it. So you can work at low res and then later on scale things up to high res. But for now, pick a width of 550 pixels, a height of 550 pixels, call it Chalice, and click OK. Now, this will not be an exhaustive look of every feature of Photoshop 3D. That would interrupt the flow of this real-world design exercise. But I do want to take enough time to make sure that we all understand a few basic concepts about Photoshop's 3D system and how it works. So to do that, let's add one of the canned objects that you can make inside Photoshop. We'll come up to the 3D menu and choose New Shape from Layer. And basically, this is going to convert our background layer, which is white, and that's completely fine, to one of the shapes that you see in this list here. From soda can to wine bottle, let's pick hat. The important thing is to just pick an object that's asymmetrical, so it's easy to see what we're doing when it comes to navigating. And in addition to that, I'm going to hit the F key to fill the screen with our hat and hold the space bar down to pan it over so that we have a nice clear view of it. We don't need to pay any attention to the elements that are now inside of our 3D panels. We're going to get to those in pretty good detail soon. But it is worth noting two sets of tools in our toolbox that are going to be very important. On my screen, I'm going to need to click on the menu bar to go double wide here. On your screen, you probably have plenty of room to have a single vertical bar. But the two sets that I'm interested in are the 3D object tools and the 3D camera tools. They look kind of similar. They both, by default, have this little orbit symbol, one of them with a sphere, one of them with a camera. So at a glance, you should be able to tell what they are. And hidden inside these tools are many different variations. And rather than looking at them down here, as soon as one of them is selected, you can see all of its brethren and sistren up here in our options bar. And we can see that the various object manipulation tools are the rotate tool, which allows you to rotate the object around, the roll tool, which rolls the object on an axis that's perpendicular to the screen, the pan tool, lets you move the object around, parallel to the screen, what they call the slide tool, which allows you to move the object away from you or towards you in the scene. Let's see if we can get it back to where it started. There we go. And then the scale tool, which allows you to scale the object. All very useful. And perhaps the most useful tool, because it's very, very easy in Photoshop to get lost or really mess something up, is the home button that you see up left, which when clicked allows you to quickly restore the default settings. Now, similar to that, there are camera tools, which do not affect the object. They affect the view of the object, and they're just slightly different. Some of them are similar, including the orbit tool and the roll tool. Also the pan tool, just like panning the object, and what they call the walk with the 3D camera tool, which allows you to move in and out of the scene. But there's this other tool called the zoom tool, which allows you to change the camera's perspective as if you were zooming in on the scene or out of the scene as needed to match the perspective of, for example, a pre-shot background. And once again, you have a home button that allows you to restore the default settings. Now, when it comes time to manipulating the object, rather than using the object tools, I prefer, in general, to use the little widget that you see right here. Now, this widget affects the entire scene. So if you have multiple objects in a scene, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, the widget won't necessarily work for you. But for our purposes now, let me click and drag this menu bar, because you can reposition this anywhere on the screen, bring it into view, and let's talk about this interface. It's a really intuitive way to manipulate things that you see on screen. But first, let's talk about the widget itself. Sometimes you might lose it. It might go away. And the most likely reason that would happen is that you've accidentally clicked on its menu bar when you were attempting to go for another tool and sent it away. Whoops, it's gone. If you don't see it on your screen, if you can't find it, and you know that you have a 3D tool selected, because it won't show up unless one of the 3D tools is selected, it's probably hiding behind your tool panel. So move your tools out of the way. There's the little icon for bringing the widget back. Click, and it comes back. So that's a useful thing. Another very useful thing is the zoom tool on the right portion of the menu bar for the widget, which if we click and drag to the right, allows us to create a bigger widget. And especially on really large screens, say you have a 30-inch monitor, this can be tremendously useful for seeing what you're doing. In the case of our training here, it'll help make things look really clear as well. Okay, this is one of those places where OpenGL may betray you. If you can't see the 3D navigation widget at all, it means your video card is probably not fully supporting Photoshop 3D, and some features may not show up for you. If this happens, there are little number boxes in the toolbar for position and rotation, depending on the tool you have selected, and you can do a lot of what the widget would accomplish by adjusting the values there. If this gets to be too complicated, well, just do the best you can, or sit back and watch for a while. You'll have the opportunity to load up a copy of my project at the start of the next chapter. So, the three arrows that you see, the three kind of fancy arrows with all these little things hanging off of them, represent the three traditional axes of 3D space. In most applications, the horizontal arrow represents the x-axis, the vertical arrow represents the y-axis, and into and out of the screen, this red depth arrow represents the z-axis. It's not really going to affect us much in the course of this series, but just so that you know the jargon. And the way that this widget works is that each of these axes has controls attached to it. The arrows that you see at the end allow you to move your object along the axis that you choose. So by clicking and dragging the arrow, we're moving the hat up and down. By clicking and dragging the arrow on the z-axis, we can drag it away from the camera and back towards us. We'll click home once again to restore it. And let's look at the next level down of control. If you hover over this curved box control, you'll see this hoop that draws itself on screen. And if you click and drag that widget, you end up rotating the object. And you get this helpful blue pizza pie slice that indicates how far you've rotated. Click and rotate back, and you'll see that slice again. This again works across all of the various axes, allowing you to precisely orient an object in 3D space. Go back once again and click home. And the next item down is this little box. This is the scale box. So clicking and dragging on any individual axis will allow you to scale along just that axis. So click and drag along the y-axis, and we've made ourselves a top hat. Click and drag along the x-axis, and we've made ourselves a very, very skinny top hat. Once again, click home to undo those changes, and note that the center of our widget offers control as well. If we click and drag on the cube itself, that allows you to scale up and scale down the object uniformly. Very, very useful. And as you hover outside of the cube, you'll see these little squares show up. This square is along the x and the y axis. This is along the y and the z axis. And clicking and dragging that square will allow you to move the object on the plane, anywhere along the plane of that axis. So this will allow us to move up and down and away from us, but not right and left, or at least according to the orientation of this widget. But hopefully you understand that visually and you see what it means. Another important thing about the widget is that it can be repositioned. You've already seen me do that, but just to reinforce that, this will come into play a little bit later, but you can click on this bar and drag the widget anywhere on screen that you need it so that it is handy and not blocking your view of the scene. So now that you sort of understand the coordinate system inside Photoshop, let's get down to the business of building something from scratch. We're not going to make something out of canned objects like hats and donuts. We're actually going to make something that's not already inside of Photoshop. So let's come over, create a new layer, delete the background layer. We don't need the hat, and give ourselves a nice neutral canvas to start building our chalice.